The moment Karen's scream pierced the midnight silence, the entire neighborhood lit up like a Christmas tree in July. Porch lights flipped on, curtains twitched, and I stood frozen in my hallway, watching live security footage of a 50-something woman in a pink robe and leopard slippers trying to pry open my garage with a crowbar. Her voice echoed through my property, shrieking something about illegal humming and government radiation. What she didn't know was that the moment she crossed that threshold, she didn't just break into my garage. She broke into an active FBI mobile command unit. And now, the entire cybercrime task force was watching her on 20 different feeds, eating popcorn and debating whether to arrest her on the spot or let her dig her own grave. Welcome to my life. It all started 3 weeks earlier, when I moved into this sleepy, rule-obsessed suburban cul-de-sac in Northern Virginia. I was fresh off a relocation order from the Bureau. The plan was simple: integrate quietly, keep the surveillance unit low profile, and complete the final phase of an undercover cyber sting operation. My garage had been outfitted by Bureau engineers. Camouflaged ventilation, dampened server noise, and even fake storage boxes in case any nosy neighbors peeked inside. I'd spent months helping design it. It was perfect, until Karen happened. On day 2 of moving in, she showed up with a stack of papers, a fake smile, and a clipboard that weighed more than her dog. Karen introduced herself as the interim permanent head of the HOA Neighborhood Standards Enforcement Committee, which I'm pretty sure is a title she gave herself. She walked me through a list of the HOA's guidelines like I was a second grader who'd just moved in from the Wild West. I smiled, nodded, and declined her invitation to attend the weekly community behavior audit. That's when the smile faded and she said, "We like things quiet around here." The first complaint came 2 days later, officially. A neatly folded notice in my mailbox warned of continuous mechanical humming after 9 p.m., which violated HOA Article 7, subsection C, line 3. The mechanical humming? That was the encrypted hard drives syncing during a live surveillance op on a ransomware crew operating out of a shell corporation 20 minutes away. I didn't tell her that, of course. I walked over, told her the noise was legal, and explained I worked for the government. She looked me up and down like I was lying, then said, "Well, the HOA is watching too." I wish that were a joke. From that moment on, it was war. Silent, petty, HOA-fueled war. I started catching glimpses of her in my security footage, hovering on the sidewalk with binoculars, hiding behind her rhododendrons, and once, even flying a toy drone dangerously close to my roof. I submitted a formal complaint to the HOA. It was immediately dismissed. Apparently, Karen was the only one who reviewed the complaint. Then came the package incident. One of our confidential shipment boxes, containing decoy equipment meant to look like regular tech, was mistakenly left outside by the Bureau courier. Within 20 minutes, I caught Karen on video inspecting the box, shaking it, even sniffing it before walking off like nothing happened. That night, she rang my doorbell, insisting I come clean about whatever was in that weird vibrating Amazon package. I told her she was dangerously close to committing a federal crime. She just snorted and said, "I have a right to know what's in my neighborhood." The final straw came the night of the break-in. I was on a late call with Agent Morales, monitoring a suspected data breach lead when my phone buzzed with a silent alarm. Unauthorized entry garage. I flipped to the security feed and there she was. Karen, standing in my driveway, crowbar in hand, muttering to herself like a cartoon villain. I watched as she yanked the side panel open and slithered inside, completely unaware that the garage door had an automatic lockdown trigger linked to her motion. Within 3 seconds, red lights flashed, electromagnetic locks snapped shut, and a booming digital voice blared. Warning. Federal surveillance facility breached. Authorities en route. She let out a blood-curdling scream, tripped over a cable tray, and knocked over a case of encrypted backup drives. I sprinted out the front door just as she started banging on the inside of the garage, screaming for someone to call 911 because she was being kidnapped by robots. By the time I reached the keypad, she was on the floor, clutching her ankle and still yelling about sonic weapons. I entered the override code and opened the door. She scrambled out like she'd seen a ghost. The red lights faded, but the cameras didn't stop rolling, and neither did the damage. Within 15 minutes, my phone exploded with calls from HQ. Morales was furious, not at me, but at the fact that our entire operation was now at risk of exposure because of a nosy neighbor with a crowbar and an oversized sense of authority. We had live feeds going to Quantico, DC, and New York, all watching the same insane footage of Karen stumbling around our sensitive equipment. I stood there trying to explain to the responding agent that yes, I had warned her, no, I hadn't touched her, and yes, she broke in voluntarily while claiming I was storing alien satellites in my garage. She refused medical attention but promised to sue me for psychic injury. Her last words before limping down the street were, "This isn't over." And I believed her. The next morning, it got worse. Much worse. Karen posted a 10-minute video online titled, "Government Man Hiding Alien Technology in Suburban Garage." It had everything: shaky footage, dramatic narration, and absolutely zero fact. She accused me of mind control, microwave harassment, and code-violating shelf placement. By noon, the video had 200,000 views. By 2 o'clock, the HOA was knocking on my door again. This time with Karen holding a homemade Geiger counter and a printout of the HOA bylaws. She wasn't just mad. She was mobilizing. And she had no idea just how deep a hole she'd dug herself into. Because while she was accusing me of running secret tech experiments, she had just unknowingly walked straight into the middle of a multi-state cybercrime operation, and the FBI doesn't like it when their cover gets blown by someone named Karen with a Facebook group. This was no longer a neighborly dispute. This was the beginning of a full-blown suburban war. The following morning, I sat at my kitchen table sipping lukewarm coffee, re-watching security footage of Karen's late-night garage adventure while wondering whether I had accidentally moved into the neighborhood equivalent of an active volcano. Outside, things seemed deceptively calm. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed, and joggers passed by with wireless earbuds and peaceful smiles. None of them had any idea that just 12 hours ago, their HOA president had triggered a federal lockdown by breaking into an FBI surveillance garage with a crowbar and a warped sense of justice. The peaceful exterior didn't fool me. Karen was still out there, scheming in her pink robe, plotting her next move, probably drawing conspiracy diagrams with red yarn and glitter glue. My suspicion wasn't misplaced. At 10:07 a.m., my phone buzzed. A notification from the mobile command unit read, "Motion detected, perimeter south side." I tapped the feed inside. There she was again, Karen, armed with binoculars, a notepad, and a bright orange vest that read Neighborhood Watch Plus in bold black letters. Where she got that vest, I had no idea, but I suspected a poorly photoshopped Etsy store was involved. She stood 5 feet from my mailbox, narrating to her phone about unmarked tech vans, strange sounds, and suspicious cables coming out of the garage. At one point, she actually measured the grass height with a ruler and nodded to herself like she'd uncovered a clue. By noon, she had assembled what I can only describe as a volunteer surveillance crew, 3 retirees and a teenager who clearly thought this was some kind of live-action roleplay. They took shifts walking up and down the sidewalk in front of my house, logging every bird, breeze, and passing squirrel. The teenager even had a walkie-talkie. Karen called it a community vigilance initiative. I called it a legally questionable harassment campaign. Either way, it was escalating fast. While Karen assembled her watchdog Avengers, I was on the phone with Agent Morales. He'd reviewed the footage from the night before and, after pausing for a long sigh and one dry, "You've got to be kidding me," gave me strict orders to keep the peace. Our cybercrime sting was still active, and despite the setback, it wasn't over. The ransomware gang we'd been tracking had recently shifted servers, and the tech in my garage was the final relay to confirm their new location. Any further exposure could jeopardize months of work. The Bureau couldn't pull me out without compromising the entire case. Morales didn't want to risk a confrontation, at least not yet. I understood the orders, but Karen had other ideas. That evening, she went door to door handing out flyers that read, "Protect our neighborhood, investigate the mystery garage," complete with a blurry photo of the server rack she'd captured during her break-in. The woman had literally committed a federal crime and was now printing it like a campaign poster. One of my neighbors, Steve, a retired Navy guy, brought a flyer over and said, "You should know, she thinks you're building a death ray." I laughed until I realized Steve wasn't joking. At 8:42 p.m., things took a turn. The Mobile Command Unit's security system registered another intrusion attempt, not physical this time, but digital. Someone was pinging the system with amateur hacking attempts, clearly using a cheap packet sniffer to probe for open ports. Normally, I'd write this off as some bored teenager from across town, but the IP trace led to the Wi-Fi router 2 houses down. Karen's house. Whether she meant to or not, she was now actively interfering with a federal surveillance operation. I immediately contacted Morales, and within the hour, we had a local asset, an undercover field agent, preparing to pay Karen a visit. What Karen didn't know was that one of the board members of the HOA, a quiet, khaki-clad man named Dennis, was actually embedded with the Bureau. He had been placed in the HOA 6 months ago to monitor a different resident, one who had ties to the digital crime syndicate we were tracking. But with Karen now elbowing her way into the spotlight, Dennis had been reassigned to keep an eye on her full-time. Dennis called me shortly after and said, "She's planning something bigger." Her words, "I'll expose him if it's the last thing I do." The next day at the community center, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. Dennis and I both attended, me in the back row with a baseball cap, Dennis sitting near the front, taking careful note. Karen stood on stage with a laser pointer and a homemade PowerPoint presentation she titled, "Digital Doom in Our Driveway." She flipped through slides showing my house circled in red, graphs of decibel levels at random times of day, and even a hand-drawn chart labeled Vibrations versus Brain Fog. Her piece de resistance was a dramatic reenactment video she filmed with sock puppets, depicting her garage break-in as a patriotic act of civil disobedience. She received a standing ovation. I felt like I was trapped in a badly written TV movie. Then came the motion. Karen demanded the HOA form a special oversight committee to inspect my garage and determine whether it violated neighborhood code. Several residents raised concerns. One elderly woman said, "Isn't that dangerous if it's government property?" Karen replied, "That's exactly why we must inspect it." Another neighbor asked what credentials the committee would need. Karen said, "A strong sense of duty and a flashlight." Dennis raised his hand and calmly said, "Wouldn't forcing an inspection on someone's personal property without legal cause violate several privacy laws?" Karen dismissed him with a wave and a comment about deep state operatives in our HOA. I nearly choked on my coffee. After the meeting, I followed Dennis to the parking lot. He looked at me and said, "She's gone full conspiracy theorist. We need to contain this before she blows the whole operation." He explained that he'd intercepted Karen talking to a man over the phone, someone who might be linked to our main target. Karen thought she was reaching out to a local reporter. She wasn't. She was now unwittingly dragging a known associate of a cybercrime kingpin into the heart of our neighborhood. And if we didn't act fast, this whole thing could spin wildly out of control. That night, I sat in my kitchen, the command unit humming quietly behind a sealed garage door, while outside, Karen's Neighborhood Watch Plus patrolled like a group of paranoid mall cops. The situation had become absurd, but dangerously so. Karen believed she was saving the neighborhood from a tech-fueled doomsday, but in truth, she had just crossed into a world where one wrong step could expose a federal operation, endanger lives, and blow the lid off a case the FBI had spent over a year building. And the worst part? She still had no idea just how deep she'd wandered into the rabbit hole. At precisely 6:12 a.m. the following day, I woke to the unmistakable rumble of heavy engines outside my house. I blinked away sleep and stumbled to the window just in time to see 3 matte black SUVs pull up quietly and park along the curb like shadows arriving early for a funeral. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, scanned the street, and gave the all-clear signal. I didn't need to ask who they were. This wasn't Amazon Prime. The bureau was here, and they weren't in a friendly mood. I threw on a shirt and met them at the front door before they could knock. They slipped inside with practiced precision, ducking past the window like ghosts. One of them handed me a tablet and gestured toward the garage. The screen showed a blinking live map of data traffic. Except this time, something was different. A new spike in wireless activity had appeared overnight, and it wasn't from our setup. Someone had either installed or accessed a rogue network node nearby. Morales's voice crackled through the earpiece. "We think Karen's house is being used to route encrypted traffic. You've got a leak." For a moment, I thought the absurdity of that statement might actually cause me to pass out. Karen, queen of the clipboard, the HOA messiah, the same woman who'd once accused a neighbor's garden gnome of being a spy camera, was now an unwitting link in an international cybercrime network. I asked how that was even possible. Morales explained that during her many investigations, Karen had apparently clicked on a phishing link sent through a fake HOA website we were monitoring as bait. That link had granted back-end access to her Wi-Fi, which criminals were now using as a passive data relay. She didn't know it, of course. She just thought her internet had gotten faster. We couldn't confront her, not yet. Not unless we were ready to burn the whole operation. Instead, Morales wanted to use Karen's sudden rise to neighborhood stardom as a distraction. The more attention she pulled, the more pressure would fall away from our real target. They were still out there, 2 counties over, growing increasingly paranoid. If we played this right, Karen would unknowingly help flush them into the open. But it was a gamble. The Bureau was essentially betting the success of a federal sting operation on a woman who thought her cat food was being mind-controlled by microwave. By mid-afternoon, Karen was live-streaming again. This time, she stood in front of her house next to a sandwich board that read, "Exposing Suburban Secrets, tonight at 7. I watched from my window as cars actually pulled over to ask what it was about. She handed out printed evidence packets containing grainy screenshots of server racks and a blurry image of me eating a sandwich near the garage. She had somehow convinced half the block that I was running an illegal broadcast tower for foreign interest. One neighbor, bless his soul, asked if I could boost his cable signal. Karen glared at him like he'd betrayed the rebellion. That evening, the community investigation event began. Folding chairs lined Karen's driveway. Someone brought a projector. She kicked things off with a dramatic reading of HOA rulebook excerpts, followed by a slideshow of images she'd collected over the past week. At one point, she played a sound clip she claimed was evidence of sonic interference. It was literally just the hum of an industrial cooling fan, but to the untrained and very impressionable ears of suburban paranoia, it sounded like a threat. They ate it up. Meanwhile, inside my house, the Bureau team monitored everything in real time. We had audio, video, even biometric scans from the crowd. Morales, watching from Quantico, muttered, "This is either going to get us promoted or end with us all in a Senate hearing." The longer Karen talked, the more animated she got. By the time she unveiled her final proof, a hand-drawn map connecting my house, the water treatment plant, and a 7-Eleven, for some reason, Morales gave the go-ahead for Phase 2. That meant turning up the heat, figuratively and literally. The command unit activated a thermal drone to sweep Karen's backyard. We needed to confirm if any hardware had been physically placed there. The drone flew silently, capturing images of a recently disturbed patch of dirt behind her tool shed. That's when we found it. Tucked beneath the soil, cleverly camouflaged among gardening supplies, was a relay node about the size of a shoebox. It was routing traffic using her Wi-Fi as a decoy. Karen hadn't placed it, but someone had. I watched in stunned silence as agents cross-referenced footage from days earlier. We found him, Karen's cousin. The same one she'd FaceTimed during her break-in. He'd visited 2 nights ago under the guise of helping fix her lawn mower. He wasn't a technician. He was on our list, a low-level courier for the same syndicate we'd been tracking. Karen had unknowingly hosted a data drop. Morales gave the green light. We were moving forward with a quiet extraction. That meant removing the node without alerting Karen or her HOA followers. At exactly 4:02 a.m., 2 plainclothes techs infiltrated her backyard, disarmed the device, and replaced it with a harmless decoy. Karen's neighborhood watch group never noticed. They were too busy arguing in a Facebook thread about whether my recycling bin violated street symmetry. The next morning, the news broke. Not about the sting, of course, that was still classified, but about the larger cybercrime ring. The Bureau had used the data captured through the Karen relay to track the network's final server hub. A raid occurred 90 miles away. Multiple arrests, confiscated hardware, millions in laundered cryptocurrency seized. The operation was a success. Morales called it a miracle disguised as a neighborhood meltdown. But while we celebrated quietly behind the scenes, Karen was furious. Her latest livestream accused the deep state of stealing her investigative property. She claimed her garden had been tampered with and that her pet rabbit had changed its behavior, which she took as proof of brainwave manipulation. That afternoon, she stormed up to my door and pounded on it like it owed her money. When I opened it, she launched into a monologue about transparency, citizen rights, and the suspicious lack of birds near my driveway. I just stood there, silent, letting her vent. She waved another manila folder in my face and warned that she had contacted multiple media outlets. I said nothing. She stomped away. What she didn't know was that every one of those outlets had already been briefed by the Bureau. None of them were taking her seriously. One had written her off as a colorful suburban personality with an active imagination. She had no idea just how close she'd come to derailing a federal operation, and even less idea that we were far from done with her. Because now that we had evidence linking her cousin to a criminal network, Karen's backyard data relay was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a clue. And if she thought the neighborhood was strange now, she had no idea what was about to happen when the Real investigation moved in next door. By the time Thursday rolled around, the neighborhood looked almost normal again, almost. Kids rode scooters up and down the sidewalks, lawn sprinklers ticked rhythmically across manicured yards, and the air smelled like someone nearby had mastered barbecue. But beneath that calm suburban skin, a full-on federal operation was unfolding in quiet, precise movements. I wasn't even pretending anymore. My phone was buzzing constantly with secure messages, surveillance drone data, and tactical updates, and my garage, the command unit Karen had so lovingly tried to expose, was now the beating heart of a coordinated takedown plan. And like it or not, Karen had officially become a variable we could no longer ignore. She wasn't just annoying. She was connected. That afternoon, I stood outside talking to Dennis, the undercover agent embedded in the HOA, while pretending to discuss lawn fertilizer. He had just come from reviewing newly decrypted data from the confiscated relay found in Karen's backyard. It confirmed our suspicions. The device had been activated remotely during the cousin's visit, and the exact access logs lined up perfectly with known activity from a cartel-tied laundering network. This wasn't some random Wi-Fi hack. It was part of a broader infrastructure. That meant Karen's property had become a node in a system of digital laundering, and whether she knew it or not, she was about to become the centerpiece in a legal firestorm. We had one shot left. The final suspect in the network, known only by his alias, Jacketman, was due to make contact at a secondary location. The location was less than 2 miles away, at a country club where Karen's cousin had signed in under a fake name during his last visit. The meeting was supposed to go down that Saturday. That meant we had roughly 48 hours to prep and position. Unfortunately, Karen picked that exact time to double down on her chaos campaign. At exactly 7:13 p.m. Thursday evening, Karen announced on Facebook Live that she was hosting an emergency HOA safety audit. It would be a door-to-door initiative, starting with what she now referred to as the epicenter, my house. She said, and I quote, "If the federal government won't answer our questions, we as citizens must act." The livestream cut off when her neighbor's cat jumped onto her table, knocking over her poster boards, but the message was clear. She was planning to come inside. Dennis and I scrambled to redirect. Morales gave us the go-ahead to initiate a legal maneuver we'd been holding in our back pocket. A sealed subpoena allowing a full search of Karen's property, including electronics, cloud accounts, and security devices. But it had to be executed quietly. We didn't want her going public with it before the arrest of Jacketman, and certainly not before we secured her devices. So we came up with a cover. Friday morning, while Karen was out leading a yoga class in the park, which she was not certified for, by the way, 2 agents posing as HOA compliance inspectors entered her house with the help of a friendly neighbor who had a spare key. While one agent downloaded data from her smart hub and router, the other sifted through boxes of old electronics in her garage. That's when they found it. Tucked in a cardboard box labeled holiday wreath hooks, was a burner phone and a USB stick. The phone was clean, likely bought by the cousin and left behind. But the USB stick was gold. It contained partial encryption keys and fragments of the software used to bounce data through the relay. It was evidence, pure and damning. Karen might not have been smart enough to plant it or use it, but she was now in possession of tools tied directly to digital financial crimes. And worse, her cousin had registered a flight out of the country the next day. Morales was done playing nice. He authorized a coordinated sweep. We would detain the cousin at the airport, arrest Jacketman at the meetup, and bring Karen in for questioning, all in under 12 hours. I was told to be ready at a moment's notice. The command unit would serve as our mobile base for the entire operation. And that night, while I sat in my kitchen going over mission logistics, Karen knocked on my door again. She didn't look angry this time. She looked proud. She handed me a piece of paper, another HOA notice, and said, "This is your final warning. If you do not permit an official inspection of your garage by tomorrow, I will escalate this to the neighborhood tribunal." I asked what the tribunal was. She said, "It's me. And I'm not bluffing." Then she turned on her heel and marched back to her house with the triumphant walk of someone who had just delivered a speech in a courtroom drama. I closed the door and called Dennis. He laughed for 10 straight seconds, then said, "Get some rest. Tomorrow everything changes." At 5:03 a.m. Saturday morning, the command unit lit up. Jacketman had arrived at the country club. He wore a dark windbreaker, aviator sunglasses, and the world's worst fake mustache. He was carrying a briefcase and a phone linked to one of the compromised accounts we'd been tracking. Our agents moved fast. He was taken into custody by 5:18 a.m. The briefcase contained encrypted hard drives and 2 flash drives matching the format found in Karen's garage. At 6:07 a.m., we intercepted Karen's cousin at the airport using a fake emergency boarding gate announcement. He was caught mid-text with one of the cartel's shell contact. When questioned, he immediately rolled over and began naming names, including his explanation of how he used his aunt's place as a safe drop zone. And that's when the knock came on Karen's door. It was Dennis and 2 federal agents, dressed like postal workers but holding credentials that could shut down a city block. Karen answered in a bathrobe and curlers, holding a coffee mug that said, "I'm always right." The moment she saw the badges, she started filming on her phone. She tried to claim it was a prank, a smear campaign, a deep fake. But the moment they showed her the photos, her cousin, the device in her garden, the USB drive, they said she went quiet. For a whole 4 seconds. Then came the yelling, the accusations, the threats of lawsuits and interviews. She was not arrested, just brought in for formal questioning. But her face when she saw me walking out of my house and stepping into one of the black SUVs? Priceless. The operation was over. The network was down. And as far as the Bureau was concerned, we had succeeded. The mission log would forever record it as Operation Apex Relay. But Dennis and I had already nicknamed it something else. Operation Karen Storm. It had been 3 weeks since the takedown, and while the official case files were stamped, sealed, and shuffled into government archives, the fallout in the neighborhood was just beginning. The HOA bulletin board, once a place for lost pet flyers and reminders about lawn height, now featured passive-aggressive notes about certain individuals bringing unwanted attention to the community. Karen, despite being at the center of a multi-state criminal investigation, had returned with a vengeance. She had started calling herself a whistleblower. Not only that, but she had hired a lawyer. And that lawyer had filed a civil suit against me, the FBI, and somehow the Department of Transportation, for what Karen now described as emotional damage, unlawful surveillance, and character defamation by association with undesirable entities. In layman's terms, she was mad she got caught being accidentally involved in a criminal operation and wanted someone to blame. It was absurd, but not surprising. Karen wasn't the kind of person who could fade into the background. She needed the spotlight, and when she wasn't getting it, she'd drag it back to herself even if it meant throwing gasoline on her own porch. The suit wasn't going to hold water, obviously. Everything had been by the book. Her cousin had confessed. The devices were recovered. The evidence chain was locked tight. But this wasn't about logic for Karen. This was about ego. She didn't want justice. She wanted revenge. The court date was set for a preliminary hearing, and I was required to attend along with a bureau representative. Morales sent Agent Kincaid, a straight-talking litigator who looked like he hadn't smiled since the Cold War. We met outside the courthouse, and after scanning the front entrance for hidden cameras, Karen had a reputation now. We walked into the building, past a crowd of reporters who clearly had no idea what this case was actually about. Inside, Karen sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a dramatic neck brace and large sunglasses like she'd just come off the set of a soap opera. Her lawyer, an overly enthusiastic man with a tie too wide for his collar, stood to make his opening remarks and declared, "We are here today because my client has been psychologically and reputationally destroyed by an out-of-control government and a man who used her community as a cover for secret activities." Kincaid didn't flinch. When it was his turn, he calmly stood, opened a folder, and said, "Your Honor, we have video evidence of the plaintiff breaking and entering into a federally secured mobile command unit, multiple live streams in which she accuses the government of mind control, and a sworn statement from her cousin detailing her home's involvement in a criminal data laundering scheme. We would like to motion for immediate dismissal on grounds of baseless litigation." The judge, who looked like he'd seen 1,000 petty HOA cases in his time, simply sighed and asked if Karen had any additional evidence. She stood, dramatically pointed at me, and yelled, "He weaponized Wi-Fi." The courtroom fell silent. Someone in the gallery snorted. Even her lawyer looked confused. The judge, who clearly had zero patience left, scheduled a follow-up hearing with a not-so-subtle warning that any more theatrics would be met with sanctions. On the way out, Karen turned to the press and declared, "This is not over. I will expose the truth if it takes the rest of my life." I had to admit, her commitment to delusion was impressive. Back at the neighborhood, Karen's reputation had become complicated. Half the residents avoided her entirely, treating her like a live electrical wire. The other half were confused. They'd watched her spiral into conspiracy and somehow walk out of it still convinced she was the hero. She handed out pamphlets about government interference, held truth sessions in her backyard, and even installed a new mailbox plastered with stickers that read things like "Investigate the investigators" and "I know my rights." But the biggest surprise came the next week, when a familiar face returned to the cul-de-sac. The house across from mine, which had been empty since before I moved in, suddenly had a moving truck in the driveway. I watched from my porch as a woman stepped out, waved to me, and walked over holding a folder. She introduced herself as Agent Ramos, and she said she was transferring to the area for a long-term bureau assignment. I raised an eyebrow. She smiled. The bureau wasn't done with this neighborhood, not by a long shot. It turned out that during the sting, the bureau had flagged other possible data relay sites in the region, some of which were within a 3-block radius. The operation might have ended in headlines, but the deeper infrastructure of the network had roots they were still uncovering. Karen's property had just been the first and most ridiculous crack in the dam. Ramos was moving in to quietly monitor a few remaining connections, using the house as a long-term listening post. When Karen spotted her, it didn't take long for the conspiracy wheels to start spinning again. She cornered Ramos in the street 2 days later, demanding to know why so many federal types were moving in all of a sudden. Ramos just smiled and said she liked the neighborhood. Karen didn't believe her, of course. She went online and began spinning a new theory, that the HOA had been infiltrated by a secret agency bent on controlling the suburbs. She created a new Facebook group called Reclaim the Block, and within a day she had 20 followers. Within a week, most had left after she posted a 5-minute video about how squirrels were acting strange near her bird feeder. I was finally getting ready to move out. My mission was over, and I'd filed the paperwork to transfer back to Quantico. The command unit had already been disassembled and hauled out under the cover of a late-night moving crew. As I packed up my things, I took one last look around the garage that had somehow become the center of a war between federal surveillance and HOA nonsense. It was quiet now, almost peaceful. The day I left, I made one final walk around the block. Several neighbors came out to say goodbye, offering waves, handshakes, and polite nods. Karen stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching me like a hawk. I gave her a small wave. She didn't return it. Instead, she lifted her phone and began recording. I didn't mind. Let her record. Let her write another chapter in whatever version of this story she believed. As I drove away, I couldn't help but laugh. Karen had broken into a federal surveillance garage thinking she was protecting her neighborhood from strange noises. She had no idea she'd helped take down a criminal network, become the unwitting face of suburban chaos, and inspired the FBI to plant even more agents on her block. In trying to expose a secret, she'd accidentally become part of one. And somewhere I was sure she was already drafting the next lawsuit.